Okay, let's get started. Today we're going to take a look at Chapter 1, Basic Tools for Critical Thinking About, and I would say with arguments. Just a couple of things as we're going along here. So again, we'll look at Chapter 1 today, and we'll just see how far we get. And again, like I talked about on Tuesday, this is essentially what we used to call a blended class. So the classroom is scheduled for this hour-and-a-half block because I usually teach this as a fully face-to-face class. But because I've moved a bunch of the stuff online, we're not going to spend an hour and a half in here. I'm going to have discussions, a lot of Q&A, that kind of thing will go on online. So we'll typically be kind of aiming for about 40 to 45 minutes when we're in here, about half the class period. There may be some days where I need to spend a little bit more time, but generally won't be too much more than that. And that makes the lecture videos a little bit more easy to digest as well, if they're not too long when you're looking at those later. So we'll see how far we get. I like to be kind of flexible as we go along during the semester, just kind of see, especially for those of you who are here, if you want to just sort of sit and listen, that's great, but if you have questions, you need clarifications as we go along, please don't be shy about doing that. And then we'll just kind of see how far we are. I'll let you know what to read for next time. We'll just kind of play it by ear there. As usual, this is just our second meeting, right? I've met my other class a few times. But I guess as will be usual now, after class I will upload the lecture video. Do be advised, and somebody was asking about this, and I put something on Canvas about it. But it can take a little while for the video to upload, and then it has to process, and there's all this stuff that goes on. And sometimes I also have like meetings right after class or something like that, so it might take me a little while to get to it. So usually within 2-3 hours or something it should be visible. If you don't see it within 4 or 5 hours, then maybe email me and ask me what's going on, because maybe I didn't do something right and I forgot to hit a button or something, but that rarely happens. If for some reason it were going to be longer than a couple of hours, I'd probably just let you know that I had to go to the main campus for the rest of the day or something like that. But then I just do it in the evening there. So I'll post the video lecture. Also today after class, once I'm posting that announcement with a link to the video lecture, I'll post the first discussion assignment. They're not too kind of strict. I'm going to talk about this in the directions for them, but it's just basically meant to kind of duplicate what we would normally do in a fully face-to-face class. In this case, and in several cases, there will be a short video for you to watch on critical thinking, and then basically I just ask you to kind of write a paragraph or so telling me kind of something that you got out of the video, and then once other students posts show up, then pick at least a couple of your fellow students to just kind of respond to, say if you agree, disagree with what they said, maybe just elaborate on what they said, that kind of thing. And there will be some detailed directions there in the actual assignment, so make sure you read those and let me know if you have questions about them. Okay, and then next time we'll see where we are, if we need to finish up Chapter 1, if we're going to start Chapter 2, we'll decide that in about 40 minutes or so. Okay. Any questions about any of that kind of general structure stuff? Are we doing okay there? Trying to be super clear about how the format works, but I know that especially with the HyFlex format, different professors are doing very different things, and I'm sure it's kind of hard to get your head wrapped around a little bit right now. So don't be shy about asking questions about that. Okay, so let's dive into Chapter 1. This is not a super deep or difficult chapter. It's just got a lot of terminology and a lot of kind of basic ideas that are going to be really important for the entire semester. So we need to define some terms and see what they have to do with. Again, his title for this is Basic Tools for Critical Thinking About Arguments. And again, I would say probably thinking with arguments. But critical thinking is obviously the key term there. So this is a logic class. It's elementary logic. Logic is an area of philosophy, kind of deals with creating and evaluating arguments to see if they're good or bad arguments in favor of different positions. So largely what we're talking about here are arguments and just what an argument is, what kinds of parts it has, how they work, that sort of thing. But I also think that this term critical thinking is really important. So a lot of the times in a logic class, the textbook is just called like logic or something like that, and then there's all these different chapters on logic. But especially in the elementary logic class, which is kind of the informal logic class for the most part, the idea is that these are tools that should be really valuable in just everyday critical thinking. That these are supposed to be very generalizable skills that you could take to other classes, that you could take to a job, that you could take to real life, to think critically about stuff. And I always kind of worry about this phrase critical thinking, because I feel like it's something that you've heard a million times. Like people are always telling you how important critical thinking is, that you need to learn how to do that. But I don't know, if your education was anything like mine, I noticed that nobody ever really said exactly what critical thinking is or how to do it. They were teaching you critical thinking often, but they didn't really label it that way. So you get this very vague notion of what thinking critically means. I think that sometimes people think that thinking critically just means sort of common sense, like just stopping for a minute to think about things in a common sense. But one of the big lessons of this whole semester is that a lot of critical thinking is not common sense, and that our common ways of thinking about things are actually not very good a lot of the time, that they don't involve critical thinking. Another thing I think that people think critical thinking is just thinking a lot about stuff. But you can think a lot about stuff and never really think critically about those things. So here I like to make the comparison to something like playing a musical instrument. I think everybody has that friend who plays guitar and he plays it constantly, but he's really terrible at it. I mean, he can play all day long, but if he doesn't practice the right sort of things, he's still going to be really bad at it. So just thinking a lot, I mean, you probably do need to think a lot to think critically, but thinking a lot doesn't guarantee that you're thinking critically. It also doesn't necessarily have to mean thinking about really big, deep, important stuff. It could just be very everyday. It has a lot of very everyday practical uses. You're doing it a lot of the times without labeling it that way. Silly things like, how many errands you have to run and in what order they should be. Sometimes that involves critical thinking about your schedule, the routes to different stores, things like that. So yes, this is a logic class, and yes, I'm here to teach logic, but I really see this as part of the larger goal of teaching generalizable, practical, critical thinking skills. And I have sort of an agenda as well. A lot of the times there's this sort of weird notions that like your professors have these agendas, and they're usually political agendas, and they're trying to brainwash you and so forth. I don't have those agendas. I do have an agenda though, and I'm happy to admit that. And it's not to get you to think any particular way about stuff, but it's to get you to think well about stuff. And if there is a value at all that I'm trying to impart in education in general, and especially this class, it's not a political value or a religious value or a moral value. It's simply the value of truth. This is one of the things that will come up even in the very first video that I'm going to post later today. Most people have a strange relationship with truth, or they prioritize truth very strangely. That most people simply have a bunch of beliefs about a bunch of things. And then if you ask them about what truth is, they will pick the things that conform to their beliefs. Right? So if they think something is true, they'll do an internet search and they'll pick all the stuff that says that their belief that they already have is true, and they'll ignore all the other stuff that seem to contradict it. So it's like they prioritize their beliefs over the truth, and they judge truth by whether it conforms to their beliefs. But it should be the other way around. What we should do is prioritize the truth and then try to believe things that are true instead of false. And that sounds so obvious, and yet for a lot of psychological reasons, it's very, very difficult. That's especially what a lot of the critical thinking videos that I'm going to share with you this semester are about. Your mind plays tricks on you, and it has all sorts of interesting ways of preventing you from really identifying the truth or believing in true things and kind of twisting things to fit your beliefs. So that's my big hidden agenda. It's not so hidden anymore. Most of us are beliefs, truth. By the end of the semester, I hope at least some people will be a little bit more the other way around, truth and beliefs conforming to that. We'll see what you think at the end of the semester, whether that worked or not. You'll probably just tell me what I want to hear. That's okay too. No, that's not okay, because that would be exactly what I said you shouldn't do. Pretending something is true because you want to believe it. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into the chapter here. Kind of starting on just 1.1 claims, chapter 7. And you can follow along here, but I'm also adding some stuff and clarifying some stuff, so definitely make sure that you take good notes. Especially for those of you who are at home, or those of you who are here but might be at home a different day. I'm still experimenting with lighting and things like that, so let me know as you're watching the videos. I can't tell really from your perspective whether having like these lights on or off makes it better or worse. It seems like it's better in the classroom, but I'm not sure sometimes if there's more glare compared to what it would be. We could try it a couple of ways if people feel like they're having trouble seeing. I'm going to try to write very clearly, and I'm trying to stay within the bounds. On the video, it looks like I have this really large board, but it's not very much space I can write in, especially if I still want to be on camera. So I might have to kind of abbreviate things. I'll try to make sure I'm writing dark enough. And I'll try to write a little more clearly. I know my handwriting is not great, but as we go along, if you're having some trouble, I would definitely appreciate that feedback. Okay, So, in philosophy, critical thinking is largely a matter of different kinds of logic. Critical thinking is all sorts of things, and you learn all sorts of different critical thinking methods in many different classes in science. Scientific methodology is a kind of critical thinking. But philosophy has some philosophy-specific kinds of critical thinking, and that largely is different kinds of logic. Now, it's really difficult to define what logic is because there are so many different kinds of it, and we're learning some kinds in this class, and then in my spring symbolic logic class, we learn some others. But I would say, very, very informally for an introductory purpose, that when we talk about logic in this class, what we mean is something like a system for creating and evaluating arguments. So what we do in logic, in different kinds of logic, informal to formal, is try to come up with ways to create arguments, but then also have a way to evaluate those arguments, see if they're any good or not. Now that, of course, leads to the question then, well, what is an argument exactly in the sense of logic? And so if you don't mind me using this word twice so I can keep things kind of up here. In philosophy, an argument doesn't mean something like a hostile conversation. That's a different sense of the word argument. This really just means, I guess sort of informally first and then a little bit more formal. It's kind of a procedure to determine whether a claim is true. If somebody states something and you're not sure if it's true, then they need to give you an argument for it, right? But even more specifically, in philosophy and in logic in general, an argument really is just a collection of statements. So whenever we identify an argument and we write it on the board, what you're going to see is me write a bunch of different statements on the board, but then refer to that particular collection as a whole as an argument. So an argument is just kind of a collection of statements. Now that leads to the question, what do I mean by a statement? And here, notice that the textbook says that a synonym for statement is proposition, and that's fine for our purposes. There is some logic about the distinction between the two, but it's not really relevant for our purposes. So if the text or I use the word proposition, just think of that as a synonym for statement. But also be very clear that a statement is not simply a sentence, because not every sentence is a statement. A statement is a sentence, but it's a subset of sentences. It's a particular kind of sentence. And the way we'll define it to begin with, it's specifically a sentence that attempts to establish something as true. So a statement is a sentence, maybe to put it a slightly different way, it's the kind of sentence that can be true or false. And not every sentence is the kind of sentence that can be true or false. There are things that are perfectly well-formed sentences, but you wouldn't say of them that they're true or false. That just doesn't seem to be relevant because they're not kind of trying to claim that something is true. So just some examples. Interrogative sentences are not statements. If you remember, it's probably been a while, but it's one of those sort of grade school grammar class things. Interrogative sentences, that's just the fancy term for questions, right? So a question doesn't state a truth, it simply asks for information. Right? If I say something like, what day is today? And you say, that's true, I think you probably didn't hear me correctly. That question can't be true or false. The answer could be true or false, right? So interrogative sentences, questions, those can't be true or false, so they're not statements, so they wouldn't show up in arguments. Okay? That seems sort of trivial, but actually if you pay attention, especially in political rhetoric, people often do include questions in their arguments, but it's usually because they're what are called rhetorical questions, where they're not really asking a question, it's just a way of phrasing a statement. So if somebody says, like, I don't know, if you say to somebody, nobody should say this to you, if you say to somebody, what are you, an idiot? Like, you're not asking them a question, you're calling them an idiot, right? And then that's the statement. So if we ever see that sort of thing, where it's a rhetorical question, try to rephrase it as a statement that can be true or false. Instead of, what are you, an idiot? Just say, you're an idiot, and then that might be true or false. Right? That's also rude, you shouldn't probably say that, but sometimes it's probably okay. Imperative sentences are another example of sentences that cannot be true or false. And again, this is sort of, it's probably been a while since grade school grammar. But an imperative sentence is a command, right? So if I say, shut the door, that's a perfectly fine sentence. It's an imperative sentence, but it's not a statement. It can't be true or false. It's not true that shut the door. That just doesn't even make sense at that point, right? And again, that seems sort of trivial, but it is interesting how often people will sneak commands into what are supposed to be arguments, especially when it's not about establishing the truth, but just trying to persuade people to do things, which we do find in political rhetoric quite a bit. Statements are probably what your English teacher called declarative sentences or indicative sentences. That's the sort of thing they define as like a sentence that tries to state a fact. So something like, and attempts there is important. Even if it turns out it's false, it's still a statement. It's just a false statement rather than a true statement. Right? So if I say today is Tuesday, that's a true statement. If I say today is Wednesday, that's a false statement. Okay? And this is an important thing we'll see in just a second here. When it comes to logic, when we talk about statements, we assign what we call a truth value of true or false to those statements as part of the process of evaluating the argument as a whole. Good so far? Questions from the peanut gallery about any of this? It's pretty straightforward terminology right now, and there's a lot of it, but we have to kind of front load some of that before we learn specific kinds of logic. This is a little bit more interesting, though. All right, so logic is about arguments, which are collections of statements, and we're going to break that down into different things in a minute. But this idea of things being kind of true or false, this does lead to some philosophically more interesting concepts here, some of which we'll talk about this semester here and there. For the most part, we are dealing with what are called different kinds of classical logic in this class. Classical because really a lot of it, especially in the Western tradition, goes back to classical Greek philosophers, though you find these sorts of ideas in non-Western philosophy as well. That's just sort of my main training, so that's the kind of thing that I'm familiar with. But there are sort of other traditions as well that do this. And classical logic, in some ways it's a good practical kind of logic to think about because it seems to many people that classical logic reflects the natural way of thinking about things. There are various non-classical logics, alternative logics that get into some weird areas, but classical logic is a good place to start. Just like, you start with Newton before you learn Einstein, so it's a little bit more straightforward. So too with logic. And classical logic has these three basic principles, let's say. Good there still? Three different principles or laws, sometimes some of them are called, or you could just think assumptions, three different basic assumptions of classical logic, which for our purposes we will largely go with this semester, though here and there it might come up as sort of interesting to challenge those assumptions a little bit. Now this is where be careful in the text, especially if later you're studying, because it looks like he's talking about these three things. There's the 2 bullet points on the bottom of page 7 and then the 1 bullet point at the top of 8. But it's actually only the first 2 he has there, and then he says something different, and I've got a different thing there, so I'm going to put them on the board. But just to be clear, when you're studying, don't be confused by this, and I'll point it out when we look at it specifically. So the 3 basic principles of classical logic. The first one is called bivalence. And it's kind of what it sounds like. Valence means like value, and bi means two, right? So according to bivalence, a statement can have one and only one truth value. There's only one truth value you can assign at any one time to a statement. And you've only got two options for which one to assign, and that is true or false. So in logic, we assign values to statements. I'm using the word value in a very general way, almost a mathematical way, like you might assign a value to a variable, but then you've got tons of different values you could assign, 1, 2, 3, whatever, etc. So too, in logic, statements can be assigned values, but according to the principle of bivalence, which is something that classical logic depends on, you've actually only got two options, true or false. And according to bivalence, a little bit more than this even, they would say every statement always has to have one truth value, but it can only have one. So it can't have 0, it can't have multiple. It gets one truth value, and you've only got two options that you can assign to it, true or false. There are different alternative modern multi-value logics that have other sorts of things, but we won't cover that in this class. That's really kind of an advanced topic, and it gets into all sorts of different things. But it's still kind of interesting, right? Because sometimes we look at certain kinds of statements and we think, well, you know, maybe you could say this statement is neither true nor false. Statements about the future, for example, right? Like, it will rain tomorrow. You might say, well, that's not true or false until it actually happens and we see what happens. Then we could say it's true or false. Aristotle wrestles with this, whether or not bivalence applies to future statements or not. For our purposes, really don't worry about it unless it comes up and it's relevant in some way. Just assume that every statement has a truth value, and maybe in the case of things like future statements, we would just say something like, well, but we just don't know what it is yet. That's all. Okay. Good there? Questions about that as we go on? Okay. The next one, I don't like to go too far down on the board, so I'm just going to start over. The next one is the principle of the excluded middle. Now, this is going to sound very similar to bivalence. In fact, it's going to sound like I'm saying the same thing I just said, but in a slightly different way. They're not exactly the same. But in order to give you an example of why they're not exactly the same, we have to get into some advanced logic stuff, and so don't worry about it too much. Just make sure you kind of have the basic definition here. And if you're like, that sounds kind of like the same thing, that's okay. Right? They are slightly different. If it's relevant, we'll come up with it, but right now it's okay. Basically what this is saying is that there's no middle ground between true and false. So according to excluded middle, it's not just that, this is where it's maybe a little bit different, it's not just that you can only use true or false, but there can't be different kinds of degrees of truth. This seems maybe a little bit counterintuitive, right? Sometimes you do want to say something like, well, that's mostly true or kind of false or something like that, but nope, excluded middle says there's no such thing. It's either true or it's false, period. Again, that might not be incredibly intuitive, but it is a principle of classical logic and something that we'll think about as we go along. Another way to say this a little bit more formally is that excluded middle says that either, let's see here, a statement or its exact negation must be true. Okay. That if you have a statement written out and you have its exact negation, and we'll talk a little bit later about what I mean by negation, but right now, fairly common sense kind of thing, right? Putting the word not in it somewhere. Right? One of those has to be true. Okay? So formally, we'll talk about some of this stuff a little bit more later, but formally you might represent this where you have some statement, and we'll just represent it with like a variable, statement A. And A could be, any statement at all. It is raining, or today is Tuesday, or whatever. What excluded middle says is that either A is true or not A is true. That given the way that the negation operator, we'll call it later, works, one of those has to be the case. Right, so for example, if A is it is raining, then what this means is that either the statement it is raining is true, or the negation of it, like it is not raining, is true. Now again, that sometimes it seems like that's not intuitively obvious, right? You might say, well, couldn't both of those be true because it's raining in Menasha, but it's not raining in Appleton? But then notice they're not really the same statement. You just didn't put in some specifics that you needed to. This would say, as long as you're specific enough, it's not raining, it's raining in Appleton, it's not raining in Appleton, one of those has to be true. And again, if you want to nitpick and say, well, in my neighborhood it isn't, but yours, again, just keep qualifying it until it's more specific, and that should be all right. Okay? So if it ever seems otherwise from the point of view of classical logic, it's usually just that we need further clarification, that's all. Okay? Good with that one? Questions there? Again, this probably sounds very similar to bivalence, but it is possible to have logics, like, for example, without bivalence, but with the excluded middle. But to explain that to you, we'd have to do a bunch of logic, and we're just getting started. So don't worry about it too much. Okay? So he talks about those two. At the top of the next page, he has his third bullet, and you might be tempted to think that's the third principle of classical logic, but it's not really, which is fine because he doesn't frame it that way. I'm the one framing it this way. But what he talks about in that third bullet is this idea of non-statements and propositions. And this is really just him pointing out something that he said before. Not every sentence is a statement. They could be questions, they could be commands, they could be gibberish, right? So that's fine. But there is, in fact, a third principle of classical logic. The principle of non-contradiction. And it says that it cannot be true that both a statement and the exact negation of that statement are both true, at least not at the same time. So if I try to say it's true that it's raining is true and it's not raining is true, then I'm just contradicting myself, right? That's just really kind of what people mean when they say contradiction. You just said two things that are the opposite of one another and they can't both be true at the same time. Okay? The more formal way that this is sort of stated is something like, it's kind of running out of room here for the board, but something like, it's not the case that both A and not A are true. Right? This would be a contradiction to say that something and its exact negation are true at the same time. Therefore, it cannot be the case. So this is just kind of a slightly more formal statement of the principle of non-contradiction. It's not the case that A and not A. It It can't be the case that it's both raining and not raining. Again, unless you need to qualify more, but then those aren't really the same statement. Those are two different statements. It could be raining here, but not raining over there. That's fine, but then they're not the same A. It's really A and B, or A sub 1, A sub 2, or something like that. So again, this largely comes down to the fairly common sense notion that people shouldn't contradict themselves. You can't say that something's both true and kind of false at the same time, or that two contradictory things are true at the same time. Right? Again, there are alternative logics that try to allow for contradictions to see what happens. For example, some people have noted that something like, this sentence is false. That statement seems to be kind of both true and false at the same time, because if it's true, then it's false, but then if it's false, it's true. Self-referential sentences are what those are called. There are these weird little paradoxes that come up sometimes, and most people just try to explain them away. Well, they can't be true, but some people have tried to come up with alternative logics to show how, in some cases, a statement could be a contradiction and yet true. That's really advanced stuff, and again, don't worry about it because we won't be doing that in this class at all, for sure. Good so far, those three principles there. Let me know if you have questions about that, and we will see how those will be relevant and important as we start learning specific kinds of logic there. Okay, so next he talks about this idea of a claim. This is still in 1.1 here. And how that maybe differs from ideas of statements and such. This is sort of, different textbooks don't say it quite this way. It's maybe a little bit odd, but the way that the author puts this forward is that a claim is simply a statement that you are genuinely asserting. It's a statement that you genuinely believe is true, and you're really trying to kind of make that true claim, as opposed to, say, a lie or a joke or something like that, right? So if you say, today is Wednesday as a prank so that your friend doesn't go to class, that's not a claim, that's a prank, right? But if you say today is Wednesday because you genuinely believe it, even if you're wrong, that's a claim you're making. Excuse me, a statement. So a lie, a prank, a mistake, all of those things, can be statements. Some of those could be claims or not. The mistake could still be a claim because you meant it, but the lie wouldn't be a claim because you didn't. Okay? You're owning it as it were. You're making a claim, you're taking a position, and then presumably creating an argument to back up that claim. And so this is again what kind of comes down to the critical thinking thing. It seems like people make claims in a lot of areas of life. Good critical thinkers want to see whether people can back up those claims with good arguments. Right? And that's what logic and critical thinking methods are really all about, figuring out how to make arguments to back up our claims. If something isn't a claim, then having kind of, arguments for or against seems like kind of a waste of time. Like once you figure out that somebody's like pranking you, you're not going to argue with them about whether it's true. They know it's not true. So there's nothing to talk about there. That means for the purposes of this class, unless we say otherwise for some reason, we will assume that any statement or proposition we're talking about is being offered as a genuine claim, that nobody's lying purposefully about something. So the author often uses the word claim interchangeably with statement, even though they are not quite the same thing. But I think it's just that he's assuming that you wouldn't make the statement unless it was a claim, and that's why. Okay? So don't be confused if I kind of, as we're going through the book, start to use claim as though it's just another synonym for statement or proposition. It is a little bit different, but that difference probably won't be relevant most of the time. Okay. Good. All right, questions about that? Clarifications? Okay, good. He also talks about this idea of a belief or opinion. I'm using the word or there because he's using them as synonyms, like you could say belief or opinion, not or as in you have to choose one, right? He's using these two words as roughly synonyms for one another because he's sort of making a certain point about this. The words belief and opinion tend to mean something different in philosophy than they mean to the average person when they use it. I think a lot of the times when people use the word opinion, when they label something an opinion, what they're saying is that it's the kind of thing that could not be true or false in any sort of universal or objective way, that it's just a matter of personal feeling or taste or something like that. Right, so when somebody says something like, I think such and such is the best restaurant, and you say, well, that's your opinion, what you're sort of implicitly saying is that, hey, there's no objective answer to what's the best restaurant. You just mean you personally like that one best, but maybe somebody else doesn't. And in normal conversation, that's fine, but the words belief and opinion have slightly more specific sorts of uses in philosophy that don't really match up to that at all. In particular, a belief or an opinion in philosophy is really just a statement that you think is true, even though you may or may not be mistaken about it. Let's put it that way. And so in most philosophy books, the way that they talk about belief and opinion is very close to what he's also calling a claim here, right? It's something you're asserting, a statement you're asserting, even though you might turn out to be wrong about it. Okay? Because of that, it does mean, even though in normal conversations it sounds weird to say, beliefs and opinions can be objectively true or false. In the context of philosophy, it's perfectly okay to say something like, I believe that 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 is a statement, and I think it's true. That is one of my beliefs. If you go through my beliefs, you will find the belief that 2 + 2 = 4. I know that sounds strange to you because usually you would say in return, well, that's not a belief, that's just true. But then you're using belief in that more conversational kind of way. And that's not really what it means here. Please.
So it can be true?
Yes.
Okay.
No, and again, just to be super clear about this, I keep moving up here. In the conversational sense of belief and opinion that you're probably used to hearing and other people saying is that it sort of implies that what was said can't be true or false. But that's just not what we mean by the words belief and opinion in philosophy. A belief or an opinion is simply something you think is true. And so in most philosophy books, when they say belief or opinion, they're not using it in that conversational way. They're basically using it very similarly to what he means by a claim there, with the notion that it could turn out to be a false claim. That means you can have some true beliefs and some false beliefs. Okay? And when you say it that way, maybe it starts to make a little bit more sense, right? Because then if you think of belief in just this more general way of things that people think are true, then yeah, it makes perfect sense to say that some people have true beliefs and other people have false beliefs. So if I believe that the world is round, more or less spherical, a little uneven, that's a true belief that I have. There are, however, flat earthers out there who believe the world is flat, and that is wrong. That is a false belief. I don't have to argue for that, right? Can we just assume that that's true? Apparently more and more people think this is true. There was like some sports star a couple of years ago who was arguing this very publicly. I don't know what to say about that. I didn't think that was a very controversial claim. I thought that was a good neutral claim to use. Apparently I've offended maybe 5% of my audience because they have alternate beliefs or alternate facts. Or I'm not going to go there. I'm going to stick with that one. I'm not ready to give that one up yet. Maybe this makes more sense sometimes too when we talk about the phrase expert opinion, right? When you say, well, a physicist has an expert opinion on physics, that doesn't mean like anything goes and hey, that's just his feelings and there's no real right or wrong. What we mean is that's somebody who would know about that kind of stuff and they have the expertise to back up that. So what's the sort of practical takeaway? For our purposes, unless it's specifically needed for some reason, I would rather just avoid these terms altogether and just stick to things like statements and claims, because I worry that when we use these terms, that people will fall into that kind of more conversational sense of thinking about beliefs and opinions, right? I feel like, and this is a good critical thinking tool, keep this in mind, this is actually a very practical one in political debates at Thanksgiving with your family and so forth. A lot of the times when people are in disagreements and they're having an argument about something, especially like politics, and they start losing, like they're coming up with really bad arguments and they realize that their opinion is not very well justified, they will try to criticize other people or even dismiss other people's claims by just labeling it an opinion, right? So you've probably had this happen all the time, right? Somebody's, arguing with somebody and somebody just says, well, that's your opinion. And it's like, yes, that's my opinion. Now let's talk about whether it's true or false by looking at the arguments for it, right? Simply labeling something an opinion does not mean that therefore it's not true or false, therefore you don't win the debate. That's cheating. You can't do that. They also do that in another way where sometimes they'll actually voluntarily attach it to their own claims. Again, usually precisely because they know they're losing the debate. And they think, well, if it's an opinion, then you can't criticize me because opinions can't be true or false. So again, you've probably run into that in political debates, like the person's clearly losing the debate. And they say, well, look, that's my opinion, and I'm entitled to my opinion, and everybody has a right to their opinion. It's like, yeah, great, I agree with all that. I know it's your opinion, you said it. I know you have a right to an opinion, it's in the Constitution. It doesn't say exactly that, but more or less First Amendment, right? But what I'm arguing about is whether your opinion, the content of your opinion, is true or false, and that's a different issue. So that's sort of the main takeaway from that. Don't dismiss other people's claims by simply labeling them beliefs or opinions as though that means it's no longer true or false. The claim could still be true or false. And don't just try to defend yourself in a really kind of wimpy way by saying, well, that's my opinion, as though that means you're not allowed to be attacked anymore. You shouldn't be attacked at all. That's a terrible way of putting it. Let's say criticized, because that's just a separate issue completely. Okay. Good. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay, great. So that's a good lecture. Next time, I think we'll continue on and maybe finish chapter 1. I don't think we'd get any further than that. We should be able to finish it. And there's some exercises at the end that we can use to review the concepts and the terminology. If we have time, we'll do that next time. Otherwise, that could roll on to the next time as well. Very good. Keep an eye out in a couple hours for the link to the video and the discussion, and then just let me know if you have questions about that stuff. All right. Thank you much.